Right, good afternoon, folks. Welcome to Churchill and to this symposium. Thank you for coming. As luck would have it, we seem not to be the only people who have had this idea, because if I can get this thing to work. I noticed yesterday that the annual Davos gabfest has had a similar idea. And when I looked at their website on the launch of this year's convention there, it turns out they're thinking about the same things as we are. This may be a good thing or a bad thing. Depends how you view Davos. But the main difference is that nobody, as far as I can see in this audience, has come in by helicopter for this particular event. The Davos show is, of course, orchestrated around particularly simple views of history. In this case, we're now into a fourth industrial revolution involving cyber-physical systems. And the World Economic Forum has just published a very long and interesting report, which maintains that there's serious trouble ahead in relation to automation, technology, and jobs. And of course, if you're an academic, the first thing you will say, and especially if you're a historian, is that this is a very old story. And it goes back at least to Elizabeth I and that famous invention of the stocking loom, and the request for a patent on it, and the way in which I think the patent was rejected on the grounds that, or the monopoly was rejected on the grounds that it would displace the work of honest Elizabethan citizens. And that's the prevailing tone one finds when thinking about this stuff here as well. But in recent times, that's to say in the last 3 or 4 years, the tone of the discussion has changed markedly. I've been trying to think about why that might be. In other words, discussions about the impact of automation and its potential and its possibilities has taken a new twist, and one can see a new intensity in discussion, a new excitement in the technology fraternity about it, and so on. And in trying to trace the origins of this, I keep coming back to Brian Arthur, an economist at the Santa Fe Institute, who many years ago, in his book on the nature of technology and how it works, he came up with the idea that much of the time what happens is what he called combinatorial innovation. That is to say, you have a number of different technologies which are proceeding and improving, sometimes radically, sometimes incrementally, on different tracks. And then there comes a moment when, for some reason, it's possible to put them together, and then you get a significant disjunction, a kind of a tipping point. This is the idea then of combinatorial innovation, which I think lies at the heart of the new excitement about what might happen as a result of it. There's a very good lecture on that subject by Hal Varian, who's an economist who is Google's chief economist and has been for years, and who wrote a really good book in the early days about the economics of information. And then what happens is that you have a number of developments which 15 years ago certainly would have been rejected as being implausible in that time frame. The poster child for that is, of course, Google Autonomous Car. There were several polls 15 years ago of people who were expert and familiar with these technologies, in which they were asked to nominate which activities, which processes, which kinds of things would lie beyond the reach of machines for the foreseeable future. And one of the points of consensus was that driving a car safely in a crowded and changing environment was going to be something that was exclusively a capability for the time being. Nobody saw this coming. Nobody, and this includes people who were really knowledgeable about the technology. So the Google car became a kind of a poster child for this. And it is indeed an extremely interesting piece of technological development, as many of you will know. Google cars have traveled, I think, almost 2 million kilometers now, with, I think, at most 13 accidents, all of which have been caused in one or another by human drivers. In other words, humans driving cars, which run into the Google cars. That in itself, of course, is very interesting if you think about this stuff, because autonomous vehicles, if they ever do come to exist on our roads, will have to also reckon with the unpredictability and cussedness and other features of human beings. So, but never mind. But the point is that the Google cars caught a lot of imagination because it seemed to be a proof of concept that the combination of a number of different technologies could do things that were hitherto unimaginable. And then you've had this wave of publications, sometimes hype, sometimes interesting, well-researched stuff. This is The Second Machine Age by Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee is, I think, the best-selling book in that area, but there are lots of others. For many of us, a key publication was the paper by Frey and Osborne in Oxford, where they looked at the 702 job categories, I think, in which that the American U.S. Bureau of Labor uses for categorizing work, and tried to make an estimate of how many of those categories might be vulnerable to automation, given the technologies that we already know about. Not technologies that we're dreaming about or hoping that will happen or something, but stuff we already know about. And they came up with this paper, which essentially argues that up to 47% of these job categories, that's nearly a half, are potentially vulnerable. All kinds of arguments about this report, including arguments about their methodologies and all kinds of other stuff. But for many people, including me, this seemed to me to be a very interesting moment in the evolution of the discussion. And then we've had, in recent times, other interesting contributions to it. For example, this book by Richard and Dan Suskind, which is a really thoughtful and I think long-researched analysis of what professions do and what might happen to them in an era where we can take for granted the kind of computing and communication technologies that we now do take for granted. Very thoughtful, very, 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 very striking in some ways, and I think if you're certain kinds of professionals, perhaps slightly troubling. And now we have the World Economic Forum yesterday releasing this massive piece of work on the future of jobs, which can be summarized by the standard sort of summarizing methods of the tech press, 5 million jobs to be lost, etc. Whether that is to do with robotics or globalization and so on, I don't know because I haven't read the report yet. Now, the response of many of my colleagues to this can be summarized in this cartoon, which basically the view is, oh, for God's sake, give me a break. We've heard this stuff forever and it's never realized. It just never pans out like that, and it's much more complicated than these engineers think, and so on and so forth. And I understand that, and indeed, perhaps they're right. But on the other hand, here and there are people who are serious thinkers, who have taken a different view. For example, Randall Collins, one of the authors of this interesting book, has a chapter on the threat to middle-class, white-collar work, and it's a pretty sobering, serious piece of analysis. He thinks this is a big deal, and he thinks it's a big deal in terms of being really disruptive for the kinds of capitalism we've been used to. And who knows, but at any rate, there are people like him who are beginning to think seriously about this stuff. Now, David Runciman and I run this project on technology and democracy. And from our point of view, this looks to us to be an interesting debate. because we're trying to figure out what digital technology means for democracy, and that's a big and shapeless question. But one aspect of it, of course, is what would happen to employment, what would happen to the economy in the circumstances where the full force of the technology was unleashed. And we're very conscious of the fact that, of the skepticism of our colleagues, that this may not be a big deal, and that if you're historically informed, you ought not to be pandering to the hype, and so on. We're sensitive to all of that. But it occurred to us that maybe some version of Pascal's wager would be appropriate here. Pascal, you remember, decided that on balance, even though there's no proof that God exists, it might be a smarter bet to bet that he did, because the downsides would be less if you were wrong. And that led me to think about the approach that Nicholas Stern took some years ago in that wonderful report he did on climate change, where again he tried to sidestep the question of which had hitherto been the dominant theme of the discussion, which was, is the science right or not? His argument basically was, it's a more prudent bet for society for all kinds of reasons to assume that climate change might actually happen and it might be serious, and to think about what we might do in those circumstances. And that gave us the idea for this symposium, which was just to do a thought experiment in the same way, or to do a kind of Pascal wager on it. Suppose these guys are right. Suppose this technology is as transformative as it appears to be. Suppose that's the case. What then? What would be the consequences of it? Social and political on that. And of course, the reason this is important for our project is because as far as we can tell, there never has been a stable democracy without a stable middle class. That's why this matters. So if we have a technology that's about to wreak havoc on middle class employment, then that certainly will have consequences for society, and it might have consequences for democracy. That's the basic idea behind this thing, and we thought this is a good time to have this discussion. And so we looked for speakers who would contribute to it in interesting ways from different perspectives.